Hey, folks, welcome to Snowpal's Software Development and Architecture Podcast. We have a very special guest with us today. We have Jason Crum. Jason's a senior enterprise architect for a telecommunications company based in Alaska. I've worked with Jason in the past for a lengthy period of time, and I have only good things to say about Jason. So I'm super excited to having Jason be a guest on the podcast. So, Jason, thanks for taking the time and welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me, and like I said I earlier, I hope that I can provide some value for your listeners and you.
Absolutely, I'm more than happy that you're taking the time to have this chat. Actually, so folks, today's conversation, the first one with Jason, we're going to talk about remote work, and I've just titled this "Remote Work and Engineer's Perspective." We'll have a couple of initial thoughts and questions, and then we can hit the ground running. But my first question to you, Jason, is my recent question to folks who show up on the podcast is, what is your favorite food item, and if you can speak a little bit about what is it, and can explain that, because sometimes I know those items and sometimes I don't know those dishes, and you can also speak to why it is your favorite.
My favorite food item.
Yep.
Okay, that's hard because there's very few things that I don't eat or won't even try. I would have to go with either butter chicken, a vindaloo, or Thai red curry. So
you said butter chicken, and the second one sounded like it was like an Indian dish, vindaloo.
vindaloo, yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah. I think I know what it is. I'm vegetarian, but I think is that a vegetarian dish, Jason? Vindaloo?
I've had it where it had meat in it, but I'm sure that it could be made without. So
Oh, okay, cool.
it's
Yep.
I prefer I like the spices and I guess the variety of tastes. I love Cajun food in general. Unfortunately, I'm the only one in my family that does, and so the opportunity for me to get it, especially in Alaska, is relatively low. So, although I did find out recently in Anchorage that there is a Cajun place that opened up not that long ago, and so I'm meaning to go there at some point, but we don't travel into Anchorage that often. So.
You spilled the beans there with Alaska, because one of the things I was going to tell the audience was you're the first guest. I know I've always, even when we work together, I always imagine, travel. I haven't yet had the opportunity to travel to Alaska because, we all know it's a brilliant part of the world. So you live, I want to say, about an hour or so from Anchorage, right, Jason?
Yes. So, and an hour in Alaska driving time is very different than an hour in
DC,
major metropolitan centers. So I live probably about 55 miles north of Anchorage. If you look on a map, it's somewhere between Palmer and Sutton. If you just go from Anchorage and look north, that's somewhere in there is where we're at.
And then I'm pretty sure it's mid-January, so it's going to be nice and warm, I presume, outside your window there, right? Nice and warm there.
Well, for us, it's not that bad. I mean, it's above zero. So at some point, you do get climatized to it or acclimated to it, and so you usually start seeing people wearing shorts towards the end of February, because it's dipped down to the single digits for so long, and then it starts creeping back up into 20s, and it's a heat wave. So.
Yeah, no, I can. You said above zero. I think we might actually be below zero today, I think, in the DC metro. Yeah. So this is awesome. So the conversation today is about remote work, right? At least the starting point of the conversation. Now, I know I've been doing remote work for most of my life, actually. And I know you've been, at least when we worked together, you were doing remote work. Are you still doing remote work, Jason?
Yeah, I was trying to think about this the other day, and I can't remember the exact time that I started, but my kids were young. They were probably 2 or 3, my first two, when I started. So I've been probably working remotely for 16 years or so. And it kind of kicked off from the fact that my boss at the time lived in Australia. He had lived in Seattle, but he had to move back to Australia for something, and I don't remember why. Um, and it was okay. If that's okay for him, then why can't it be okay for me? And so I was able to make the case of me working remotely. And initially it was going to be temporary because we ran into some situations with childcare that I had to deal with immediately, and then it expanded to the point of where it became the norm. Um, most of the projects I worked on, the people on my team were, including you, everybody was remote anyways. We had people that were working out of Homer, people that were working in Seattle, and so it just didn't make any sense for me to be driving into Anchorage every day for an hour back and forth. So 2 hours out of my day driving in. And not only that, but we, like I said, we had two kids at the time. Once they got older, we had another two kind of back to back. And then because I was able to work remotely, we were able to make it work. And that eventually grew into some other things that I'm sure we could talk about around with homeschooling, where all of our kids have been homeschooled, continue to this day. And but so yeah, it's been an interesting ride.
You know, a lot of that resonates with me because I've been doing remote work for a long time as well, most of my career. So you're much like me in the sense that you've done remote work pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and then, if I could say, post-pandemic right now. Maybe that's not a bad place to even start, digging deeper into the remote aspects and the facets of our conversation today, Jason. So between, if we had to categorize them into pre-pandemic remote work, during the pandemic, and then, if I could say, hopefully post-pandemic, are there differences, like in your experience, in your, how you approach things? Or given the fact that you've been doing remote work, the answer could be no, it's just been the same. But I want to just ask you, have you made any adjustments, or have there been any differences between, if we had to categorize them into these three sections, if you will?
So pre-pandemic, there were times that I had to go into the office for meetings, and in particular that after we stopped working together, when that project ended and you rolled off, I got moved into another project that was painful, many years, and and that required me traveling a lot. I was down in Seattle at least once a month, sometimes more, for a course of a week for meetings. We were doing architecture work and trying to plan out the next stages of the product that we were working on. And that also required me coming into Anchorage a little bit more frequently than I had before when I was just doing software development. I was part of a team where we had taken kind of a lead role on the architecture of this initiative. And so I did have to come in quite frequently to collaborate with folks. We had people that worked in Seattle that came up to Anchorage. And so when they were in town, I did go in. When that project died out, it kind of went back to the previous of where I'd come in every so often if we were doing something very specific, but most of our work was done collaboratively over Zoom, WebEx, Teams, when eventually became Teams. During the pandemic, we shut everything down. And so the entire corporation essentially went remote, with the exception of a few key areas after the first couple weeks. These are stores where people come in and have to pay their bill, have to pick up something. We tried to do most of that as remotely as possible, and obviously taking in all the precautions that were recommended at the time.
Right.
But beyond that, the rest of the company did go remote. And since then, the organization has taken a remote first approach. And in particular, IT has always kind of, where I work, has always led that effort, because we were hiring people based on their skill sets, and wherever they were within the United States, with the exception of Hawaii. And so IT had always kind of taken on, or had for years had that vision of we're going to hire people based on where they're at, or not based where they're at, but based on what they can provide us. And then the rest of the organization followed suit as part of the pandemic. And like I said, after post-pandemic, we've continued that remote first approach. We've shut down several of our offices because they're no longer needed, and we've built out what we call base camp, a large meeting space, so to speak, where there are folks who they want to come in on a regular basis. They want to have a desk. They want to have that separation between home and work, and we provide them that opportunity. And then the rest is meeting spaces for when we do need to gather, and then hoteling type offices. So if you have to go in for a meeting, but you want to work there the rest of the day, you can reserve that spot, and you have a place to work.
Perfect, right? That gives beautiful context to my next question, actually, which is, let's say I'm going to make some assumptions here, right? And then ask you the question. Say if your workplace was not an hour away, like, no traffic, let's say it was only like 10 minutes away or 15 minutes away, right? If it is only 15 minutes away and you could do, whether it's your choice to do 100% remote or hybrid, or be there 100% of the time. If Jason could make those decisions in entirety and the workplace was 10 minutes away and there was no traffic at all, what would you do? Like, what would your preference be?
I would I would probably have more one-on-one meetings at the office. If assuming everybody was within, let's say, that 10-minute drive, um, and I wanted to have a more in-depth conversation with one person, um, then I would probably go into the office for that, but then leave afterwards. Some of the more collaborative meetings, when you start getting more and more people, I do think that they tend to work better in person, and especially when you start talking about architecture and like having a whiteboard. There are virtual whiteboards, but they all suck. Not everybody has. I've got a Wacom tablet that I use, but not everybody has it. Not everybody's willing to make those investments in that hardware and have it on their desk all the time. But even then, it's not the same thing as if you're getting up there and you're talking about a design and actually working and going back and forth and that type of interaction. I do think that is missed in the remote, but we've worked around it. We figured out ways to do that, do those types of engagements, but it's still not the same. Um, for everything else, I like my space. I have my routines. I have a way of working that is not conducive to an office environment, where there's lots of noise, lots of people going around, lots of distractions. But a lot of that, I think, is just because of 16 plus years of working remotely by myself in my home has made me um, it made me kind of avoid those types of environments.
I had a feeling before, I was very excited, first of all, to get on this conversation with you, to be very honest. But I had a feeling that I was going to hear what I would be thinking myself, just somebody else actually articulate that. I had a very strong feeling that and that's exactly what is happening. When you're saying this, it's like just a, shall I say, a better looking person on the other side of the camera saying something that I actually have in my mind. And I'm being very brutally honest when I say that, because my challenge is going to be for the next 50 minutes or 50 minutes ish. Find something that I actually disagree with here. I'm going to make my honest attempt at that, because so far what you've said, just to add to folks listening, I have my little office space. I have, I work, I'm very nocturnal, work night times. Even when we did the project together, it was very convenient, Jason, because you're like 4 hours behind, Alaska time to DC, the East Coast. It is very convenient, right? Just the timing
Yep.
and the fact that, uh, a lot of what you mentioned in terms of you have the space and you've done this for a long time, you have certain habits. And, if I could call them, at least for me, quirks or idiosyncrasies or whatnot, that may or may not fit just as well in a workspace, but you do need to. It's sometimes nice to see people, because when you talked about the whiteboarding, no matter what you do on the computer, I use like Sketch and other Adobe apps and whatnot. But
Mm-hmm.
just like you mentioned, going to the whiteboard, looking at people, sort of telling the reaction, even of the person who's not literally the main person on the screen. All of those little things make a difference, right? Those are, I feel like, some of the things that you miss out in doing everything remotely. But so we talked about the niceties, right? It gives the flexibility. You're able to manage your time, yada yada yada. Those are, I mean, undeniably good things about doing remote work. But what are some things, like your ideal case? You mentioned that if it's 10 minutes away, you'll pick one-on-one meetings in certain scenarios where you want to be at work. Other times, you would rather just do the work remotely.
Yep.
But are there some things that remote work completely snatches, meaning it deprives the team, the folks in the team, of certain types of things that cannot be replaced? I mean, are there some things such as those, and if so, what are those things?
Well, I think it boils down to, well, I mean, before I dig into that, the obvious things are work-life balance, and we've heard a lot about that over the last few years. One of the things about working from home, and especially when you have young kids, is they don't know that distinction. Like, you're home and I need something. And there were many calls of where I had children running around in the background screaming and yelling because that's what kids do. And also at that time I didn't have an office because we were going through some renovations and stuff. So I was out in just behind on the other side of this wall. It's a wide open area, and next to the staircase, and so sound travels. Um, but so beyond that, it's also the shutting yourself off, and so learning when to say I'm done for the day, and being able to disconnect instead of wandering by the office. Oh, let me check the email, let me check Teams and see what's going on, and so there's a lot of discipline involved if unless you want to be on 24/7. I used to be that type of person, but that previously mentioned project broke me of that. I was working, between 12 to 16 hours a day, and as well as four kids at home, homeschooling. My wife was still working at the time, and so all of that was just a lot. And after that project ended, I couldn't. I had to stop. I I was consuming lots of caffeine, and then at night I was drinking to counter everything. And so it was too much. And I had to institute changes within myself around that discipline of I am not going to work 12 hours a day anymore, just because my computer's there, and I don't have to travel to go to work. And so, like, being able to recognize that within yourself, that if you are going towards the path of becoming a workaholic, and you're working many hours more than what you should, stepping back and kind of recognizing that and implementing some type of changes. As far as teams go, I think it boils down to the personalities. I tend to be fairly antisocial in nature. And so I don't, and I don't thrive in large crowds or groups of people. And so I don't mind the either just one-on-one or a couple people. And if you've got if your whole team is made up of people like that, then working remotely tends to be, where everybody's remote, tends to be great. If you've got people that are extrovert in nature, they really enjoy the human contact, the close personal contact. I find that those individuals probably suffer a little bit from their mental health because they don't get that type of connection from the work environment. So they have to find that outside of work. And I think that during the pandemic, that was really hard. If you were that type of person that needed human contact, unless you had a family to help provide that, you didn't get it at work, and you didn't get it in social situations. And I know some people at my organization who did. You could tell that they were suffering a little bit from that.
I'm going to add to what you just said there, right? There are people like, see, for instance, I don't know whether I'm social. I used to be really, really social. And given the fact that I started working remotely, and during the pandemic, we hardly saw anybody. And then when the company just got busy with work at Snowpal, etc. And I never had the urge to meet people. So I started believing that I didn't have the social urges. And then after a while, when every time I met people or got on a phone call or got on a video call, I would ask folks like, hey, do you see any differences? Can you tell if I'm like quote unquote antisocial? They'll be like, no, we've been talking for like 90 minutes. You don't want to hang up or end this conversation, so you're not. And then I realized, okay, maybe my core personalities probably have or have not changed. I've started just thinking I probably had changed more so than I did. And I mentioned that because as somebody who works remotely and as someone who's actually pretty chatty, you know me from the past. I've not changed. I mean, I like to talk to people. It is actually a delicate combination, right? It's a you like the space. You need that space to think. Because Jason, one of the projects, not one but a few, but one of them I did not too long ago, required that everything had to be done in a paired mode, right? You had to write every line of code, and I had, we worked collaboratively over the years, right? In all of us in our careers, and we've done a fair bit of pairing when it required that design, that architecture, that implementation. But I had not done like 100% pairing, and I want to make a mention of that. Even though this conversation is not specifically about pairing, I do want to bring that into the picture because that does play a role in the context of remote setting and vice versa.
Yeah,
I,
I haven't done that for long terms. I mean, or for long periods. I did some remote on. I mean, we did some stuff, but it was like, hey, let's solve a particular problem. Let's go through this line by line and that type of thing. I understand the kind of the draw for the pairing. I'm I'm dubious of long term if it entirely makes sense in all contexts. For
It
every single
doesn't.
thing.
Sorry to interrupt you. I was just going to say, no, it doesn't. Yeah, please
Okay.
continue. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great knowledge share. Hey, we're both working on this at the same time, assuming that both people are actively engaged. And that's one of the things that I also find doubtful is that if you've got, and it depends upon the personalities. If you've got someone like me, I tend to be a driver, very focused. I can, if I don't control myself, I can overpower situations just because if I'm engaged and I'm passionate about something, I want to see it get done. Um, and if you pair somebody like me with someone who is more of an amiable, hey, we want to get along, we, enjoying and then you end up where one person does a lot of the work because that's just how they're wired. So you have to be very careful around making sure that you're pairing personalities that are compatible and
Right.
and that are also I guess of equal nature, so that you don't end up in the situation where you've got someone that is a little bit more passive and someone that is more assertive and aggressive, kind of dominating the situation and taking control of everything.
You articulated it beautifully, right? But I want to say, much like I've worked in projects where it is sort of dumped on you, and sometimes it's your natural habitat, at other times it's not, because when you're thinking about a difficult, complicated piece of logic, you want the privacy of your thoughts, right? You want
Yep.
those 10 minutes with no sound, with nobody talking to you in your ears. Even if you do get along, right? Let's say Krish and Jason love each other. Even then, if I kept talking into your ears during the 10 minutes that you need to be able to think, Jason, it can get very painful, right? So
Yes.
I was just going to add to saying that one thing is, I couldn't agree more that you do need the personalities to get along. Other times, even when they do, you still need that space to think. But I've seen cases where you're not necessarily given a choice. You're like, hey, Jason and Krish don't even know each other. You get started on this, throw them into this, and then you got to pair. You're going to do it all the way through. And I know that it doesn't work for everybody. It sometimes just falls flat, plain and simply. And the reason I'm broad remote, pairing, I want to have a separate conversation around that. But the reason I mentioned that in the context of what we are talking about is I think remote work is something, even if it's not exactly, it's not similar. I would draw a parallel in some ways, and here's why. You mentioned earlier, remote work works for some people 100% of the time, doesn't work for some people 100% of the time, works for some people 50% of the time, and so on. There's combinations of these. How should organizations be cognizant of that? And how do you customize it? You can't. I mean, is it even possible to go to the nth extreme and customize it to say, hey, Jason likes it this way, Krish likes it that way, James could like it a slightly different way, for instance. It's difficult, right? So if for small companies, and I want to ask you, for a startup, let's assume like 2 to 10 people startups, what do you recommend that they do to go about implementing this or trying out, so it actually works well, and they don't have time and money to experiment, and you can't do the A/B testing and then learn 6 months later that things fell flat? What would be some of your recommendations? What are warning signs, and what are some good signs, and what should we do?
That's a good question. In the larger corporate context, like the company, start getting into companies of thousands of people. Um, what my organization has done, I think, meets that particular need. It's we remote first, but we provide facilities for people to come in to work. If you want a permanent desk and there's space available, we've accommodated that type of thing. If you just want to come in for a short period of time throughout the day because of social events, or you want to work with somebody collaboratively, you have the hoteling space available. When we start getting into some of the smaller organizations, like you mentioned, a startup of 2 to 10 people, um, I, I, I think it comes down to cost. Is although probably today I'm sure you can find a lot of corporate real estate for next to nothing because of
Right.
everybody being remote.
Yeah.
But it still is. It's going to be cost, and it's going to be where are the people located at. Are you centralizing around a particular hub, whether it be Seattle, San Francisco, San Jose, or where, or and you have the ability for people to travel, or are you looking for people for skills regardless of where regardless of where they live in the world? I caution strongly against mixed mode of where you've got a couple of people that work remote and a couple of people that go into the office, and where they have meetings in a meeting room, and then you've got folks that are on the phone remotely. Even with some of the new technology with Teams and some of the stuff with Zoom, it is very difficult for folks that are remote to engage with the effectively engage with the individuals who are in a meeting room. And of course it all depends upon the number of people, but every time that I've been in that situation, it's usually there's a lot of people in the meeting room and there's 1 or 2 people on the phone. And unless you are actively trying to engage the folks that are remote, they disconnect. I mean, because they can't engage. It's hard for them to give them a word in edgewise. They can't see the room, even with all the new fancy cameras and stuff. They can't actually see the expressions, the body language, which is really important when you're trying to communicate. So my recommendation for some of the smaller organizations, go all in, one or the other. And if and you have to hire based on that. And that's a decision you're going to have to make.
Jason, I think that's a fantastic recommendation. I'm going to just, digest it and then rephrase it, simply, for me to, digest it as I say the exact same thing using different words. What you mentioned there was, if a couple of people are remote, let's say a team of 4 engineers, let's say the 2 of us are doing this remotely, one from Alaska, one from DC, and then let's
Mm-hmm.
say a couple of people are in Austin, the office is located there, and they show up at work there. Compared with all 4 people being remote, has its pros and cons, sure, right? But we get used to it as a team. We are all remote.
Yep.
We dial in, we make the adjustments. But when 2 of us show up there and the other 2 are remote, I think I couldn't agree more there, because there's a certain camaraderie that's maintained, right?
Yep.
Now, if those 2 people show up there all the time, they might hang out after work, right? There's a certain rapport that's being built, which is good. I'm not saying that either, all of us have it or none of us have it at all, but it definitely resonates with me that relationship is going to be slightly different. So what you're suggesting here is, hey, either everybody in the team, in that team, the Scrum team, whatever that team is, either all of them be remote or all of them show up. But you don't necessarily want this combination of, hey, some of them are going to be co-located where other people are going to be remote, because that's going to add to more challenges in team dynamics, for instance. Right now that we mentioned, sort of alluded to team dynamics there, in an engineering standpoint, as a developer, as an architect, as coders, uh, let's say you don't have other roles. I have another question there, but let's forget other roles conveniently for a second. Let's only talk about engineers and be selfish, right? As though we are the only people in a team. Uh,
Yep.
are there what in your mind are some challenges and differences? Let's say if you had four engineers and you have a remote team, it works beautifully well, right? And then you bring a non-engineer into the mix of that remote team. Is that going to present itself with slightly different set of challenges? If so, what in your mind are those challenges?
Well, so first, you when you always cause disruption when you bring anybody else into the team. So they have the storming, forming, norming, or forming, storming, whatever it is. But the stages that a team goes through when you introduce a new person or somebody leaves, you have to your culture is going to change when that new person comes in. They're going to bring their own personality into it, and so your culture will have to adjust slightly in order to fit them. And that causes disruption. It causes problems depending upon how extreme that change is. When you start getting into a bunch of engineers, bunch of nerds that are talking nerd speak all day long, and then you bring in somebody that's a designer or somebody that's more creative in nature. Not to say that software engineering isn't creative, but artsy, I guess if we'll call it that. There has to be a translation. I've found in the past is normally you don't speak the same language, and so and also engineering types view the world more systematically and methodically usually than people who are creative in nature. We just view the world differently, and so you have to understand that and accept that when you bring somebody else in. Again, even if you bring in another engineer, you speak the same language, you view the world the same, there's going to be differences that will take time to suss out. And you just have to accept that and understand that change is change. It's going to cause disruption, and you have to account for it whenever it occurs.
You know, we are half hour in. I have half hour more, of your time. But what I want to do is actually make it two parts. Also get initial feedback before I did the second one. So I'm going to pause this podcast here, Jason. But I do have the other half hour with you, so I'm going to just, we're going to continue this conversation in like literally 2 minutes. But to end this first half hour, I know we touched about a lot of these topics about engineers doing remote work, pros and cons, going to locations that are nearby and maybe a little bit further out. What are some of the team dynamics that come into play? Uh, what would be I know this is we're just scratching the surface here. What would be your closing comments to this is very first podcast of ours?
Specifically for around remote work, do what works best for you and what options are available. There was a big push within a corporate culture of moving to remote as part of the pandemic. We've seen that is starting to be pulled back with a lot of companies requiring folks to come into the office. Kind of the most famous one that I can think of is Apple and the hubbub that caused.
Right.
And it really is kind of understanding what's important to you. Is the job itself important? And so regardless of what the corporate policy is going to be, that you follow those directions, or are you going to be seeking remote work? Because that's what's important to you right now? That's the most important piece for me where I'm at in my life. Because even though my wife is no longer in the corporate environment and handles a lot of the things around the house with the kids and the homeschooling and stuff, being here to help support her in that and helping the kids with their work or with their homework and schoolwork is important to me. And it is more important than my title, the job that I'm at. And so if I were called in that, hey, we're going to go 100% all in, everybody has to be in the office, I would start looking for another job until my life situation changes. Once all the kids are out of the house through college and all of that, then that may change. So it's prioritize. Let me circle back around here and kind of shorten this up a little bit because I am rambling. Prioritize what's important with your life at that moment. Recognize that it might change as your life circumstances change, and and find a job that suits that. It may not be the most prestigious one. It may not be, it may not be working for Apple or one of the FANG companies, and you may have to take lesser pay in order to find the situation that matches what you need, as opposed to trying to boost your LinkedIn profile.
Jason, I want to say, folks, this is coming from somebody who I highly respect as an engineer and as an individual. So any advice that Jason's sharing here, I say, please take it. You're going to be better served by taking all of this advice. So
I don't know about that, but thank you.
I'm gonna disagree there. Maybe that's my disagreement. I'm gonna disagree and say no, that is true. In the next one, I'm gonna end this and then start the next one. I want to talk about some cultural learnings in the context of remote work. Right, that's what I want to touch upon in the next podcast, Jason. But I think we are at a good point to sort of finish this one. So again, thank you so much for your time. It's much appreciated. I'm just going to end this first podcast here. Thank you.
Thank you.